And I said, I don't care about your change orders. I'm telling you what you have to do to get this right. And this gentleman turned to me and said, don't get involved in my money or I'll kill you and your family. So I decided that public projects are important and you can do your best to get it executed. But there's a line. And sometimes the culture only allows so much.
Hello, listeners and viewers. This is Warren Wade Anderson. Welcome to the 61st episode of Inside the Phoenix. This week's guest is architect Rob Rogers. As an undergraduate of Rice University's Bachelor of Architecture program and Harvard Graduate School of Architecture's Masters of Design Studies program, Mr. Rogers has recently distinguished himself with such projects as the Syracuse University Cogen plant expansion, the Henderson-Hopkins School, and Washington, D.C.'s Constitution Gardens. We had a great comprehensive discussion about urban design and the evolution of his architecture practice. In the unedited version of this conversation, I started by asking Rob to use his project at the New York Stock Exchange Financial District to illustrate his philosophy of innovation. If you'd like to hear that discussion, go to insidethephoenix.com/extras. Now, with all of that said, let's join my edited discussion with Rob, recorded at his home in Lower Manhattan, a few minutes walk from Astor Place and the Cooper Union School. Just to let the listeners and viewers know, I've known you, and I met you 21 years ago. And in a class that I took with you at Pratt Institute, I think it was architectural theory. Mm-hmm. And at that time was a critical time, not only in my life, but in your life too, because that was about the time that you had your first child.
Yes, that's right.
And you'd probably been about a year or two into the business formerly known as Rogers Marvel, right?
Yeah, I'd been practicing on my own and teaching, and started a partnership. Then I had my first child, and I always I remember in class you were so elated. You at the time I think you had cowboy boots. Still, most of the days,
and I think it was my last year. I was pretty much alone because my roommate that I was roommates with for a few years had gone. He'd left earlier, and my other friends had sort of moved off campus. And I'd broken up with this girl, and I would come to your class and take it out on the rest of the students. I don't know if you remember this, but you would give us readings to do, and I remember one particular about Peter Eisenman and deconstructivism. Mm-hmm. And someone was very reverential in preparing, reading, and you'd ask for them to make a presentation. And I was like, this is bullshit. And I was yelling at them, and I didn't know what you would do. But surprisingly enough, you were very attentive to what I was saying. You didn't say whether you agree or disagree, but I think you liked the conversation. I bring all this up for no particular reason because there's no questions there. I'm just giving a background. But in that period where all of these things were happening, what was your idea of architecture? Because I remember visiting you at your office at the time, and you were drawing, and you had the Richard Meyer book out, and you were looking at the Richard Meyer book. And I don't know if you look back then, if your architecture back then and your architecture now, if you could see a difference.
It
was a Richard Meyer one book. The
probably the
book.
early one.
Yes.
And probably if I was looking at that book, I was looking at the drawings and the communication in the drawings, probably more so than the architecture. But they were beautiful drawings, very clear.
Extremely
that really
clear.
elaborated what was going on, and that would be I'm sure I would have used that for myself or others in the office to talk about how we were making drawings. At that time, it would be I'd spent about 6 or 7 years with IMPE before I left and actually did some more graduate work in theory, and that's when I started teaching and opened my own practice.
Just to give a background, you started working with IMPE a year before you left Rice University.
That's right. Rice has a kind of a mandated internship for a full year.
Mm-hmm.
So your 5-year study is actually 6 years.
Oh, okay.
And then after you work for a year, you return for your 5th year of school. Really amazing program.
It sounds that way. And then after you graduated, you went back to IMPE, right?
Yeah, and that's what they invited me back, and I thought that's great, and I thought I'd work there for 3 years and then move back west again because I grew up in Colorado.
Mm-hmm.
And I just got into it, and I stayed there for 5 or 6 years. And that's when I realized, wow, if I don't leave, I'm going to be here forever. And I really wanted to discover my own sensibility and work towards an independent practice.
Now, during that time, towards the end of that time, you went to Harvard, right?
Yeah. I left Pei's office, and I went to Harvard and did it's called a Master of Design Studies, but I did an independent study where I worked with Peter Rowe, mostly reading and writing about the urban environment. And it was, I can't call it a sabbatical because it was expensive. It was time away from the driving professional world,
the practice, the actual grind,
to read and write and think, and that was really terrific. And that kind of let me reset my compass and odometer and whatever other metaphorical device, but reset myself to go out and start my own practice. And that's when I started teaching at Pratt.
Okay. And what was your idea? I'm going to get back to what your architecture was, but what was your idea of practice back then?
Practice was, there was the very formal model that was practiced at Pei's office. And then there's a distinction when you go out on your own, because now all of a sudden you're doing everything. And that couldn't have been more different, because it's not like Pei's office was silos, but they had deep world-class expertise in every aspect of what practice means.
Right.
And then you go out on your own and you realize, man, you just don't know anything.
And for the uninitiated, IMPE is one of the biggest architects of the 20th century. He bleeded into the 21st century, but I think he's pretty much retired now.
Yeah,
he's still alive. He's probably in his 90s now.
Yeah, late 90s.
Wow. And he did everything from the addition to the Louvre, to major laboratories, to the Javits Center, and it seemed for him the larger the project, the more comfortable that office was with the project.
Yeah, they really understood how to deal with scale and complexity, and I would say that was one thing that, when I get back to your question about what is architecture for me, one thing that I learned from that office is I really enjoy complexity, and not a self-referential complexity like Eisenman, but actually complexity that comes from what it means to engage the world. What is the program? What is the economics? What's the social condition? What's the policy? What's the materiality? Add a level of aesthetic desire. And, that to me that's when you really begin to produce an architecture that has a voice.
Okay. So you went on your own. You were practicing on your own.
I was.
you were probably doing a little project here and there.
Yeah, houses and residential work in a lobby or something. And of course, took a while. And it's hard to make a leap from, because I was working on the Louvre and I was working on Bank of China and things. That was an amazing learning curve. But when you're doing it for yourself and you're doing all those things, there's still a level of excitement about it. But I always had a goal to try and get back or get to the level of public engagement and social complexity that I saw in the Pay projects. You know, I was kind of grounded in that way. And so I did a lot of residential work early on, but it's not the goal. You know, my practice has been to get in the public realm. That's where it's my wheelhouse. It's what I enjoy. It's a way and a place to focus. And I think that you know, for me, architecture it's not just a profession, it's a lifestyle and it's a commitment. And when it is in service to the broadest public good, in a sense, and I don't mean that to be trite, but you're taking on things that embrace a large chunk of the population or a big problem or a big issue, that's where I get the most excited.
Now, the difference between working for pay, and I know this because I've worked for big firms before, is that when you work in a big firm, in order for you to be really successful in a big firm, in a lot of ways you have to specialize. Mm-hmm. And when you specialize and you do it for a number of years, and then you go out on your own, and you realize that you're not specializing anymore. You are a jack of all trades. And you need to be up to speed on, if not everything, but you have to have an understanding of what's going on all around what goes into making a building. And I don't know if that was a big shock to you.
It was a shock to me to work at the scale of houses and things like that. But there's some underpinnings that come out of practice in a large firm that carry forward. Okay. And one of the hallmarks of Pay's office was things in their case, they had a language of formal geometry for almost all projects. And one of the things that mandated was incredible geometric resolution, whether you were dealing with angles or curves or whatever it was.
So from the macro to the micro.
Absolutely. And everything all the way through. And that kind of thoroughness.
The continuity of that.
Yeah. That you can understand the idea of the building at the largest and smallest scales, and they're related in the way that they're put together, the way that they're joined. The understanding is that is very sophisticated, and it can transcend formal attitudes about how you make architecture. And it's one of the things that's taken me longer than I thought, and I'm beginning to get there now with my practice, is to get to a level of execution that gives me delight, where you really get the underlying ideas right, you get the materiality right, the detailing right, and you begin to make buildings that are, not about the cover shot. They're about their long-term spatial and programmatic performance in culture. And that takes a certain amount of maturity, I think. And it also, you got to grow to a certain size, to a certain character of project. You need to learn what you can and cannot do yourself.
What do you mean?
Need to find out where you personally excel. And then you need to fill all the holes that are left behind by what you can't do. And that means really getting the right people to help you think about buildings. the right people to help you build buildings, the right people to help you run a business. There's all those aspects. And one of the things I really feel is I'm beginning to, find and focus and concentrate on the things that I can do best, and fill in a few holes.
Well, I'm just going to state straight off the bat that you gone out on your own, and the partnership that you had with Jonathan Marvel. You're now sort of two separate firms now, and I'm not going to get into too much about that because it's still very new. It's been less than 2 weeks. It's been about 2 weeks. But I want to ask questions around it, if you don't mind. And you've spoken a little bit about what success is. I want to sort of get into. I'm going back to that Center for Architecture talk that you gave, the interview you gave, and you said that. When you went out, you started to do buildings here, especially here in the city. There's some hard knocks that you got when you started to really build in the city. And I just wanted to talk about like at least two of them where you just sort of like, oh my God, I can't believe that this happened. And I wasn't even prepared for it.
Well, there's two of my favorite stories about learning to build in New York. One was I was doing the Studio Museum in Harlem up on 125th Street, one of our first great cultural projects. It was terrific. Kinshasa Conwell was the director at the time. We had a great relationship, and we're trying to get this thing built through the city process. And that was before the current Department of Design and Construction, which now exists and has design excellence and other things. But before that was just the Department of General Services who dealt with buildings in the city. And I won't go into that a whole lot, but it's a very, very difficult way to build, very bureaucratic.
Yeah.
Innovation or quality is kind of the farthest thing from their minds.
They just want to meet deadlines and budgets.
And we got, low bid, public contract, very difficult. And I probably shouldn't, since this will be on the air, I won't give you the guy's name, but
there's no need to.
There's a contractor. The contractor selected was of Italian American descent with a classic name and a diamond and gold horseshoe pinky ring and a gun on his ankle and a guy who was always with him carrying a handbag. And one day on the construction site, we had this inverted glass tower that brought mechanical and light and air down into the galleries below grade, and they were not getting it right. And I was really holding the line, and I was going to reject this. They wanted change orders, and I said, I don't care, it's not right, you got to do this. So, I see the young architect really fighting my battles to try and get it execution. And I said, I don't care about your change orders. I'm telling you what you have to do to get this right. And this gentleman turned to me and said, don't get involved in my money or I'll kill you and your family. So I decided that public projects are important and you can do your best to get it executed, but there's a line. And sometimes the culture only allows so much. And, we got the project done and it's pretty good. But I didn't get it done everything the way I would like.
Okay.
And, that was a hard line.
Oh, yeah, well, yeah, it's there's really, it's life or death, literally.
And
it's, one more, if you could tell me one more situation.
Yeah, the other, and this is interesting because it kind of falls back in a very funny, simple, small way to what does innovation mean. But we were doing the redesign and reconstruction of the Pratt School of Architecture after the fire.
Yes, the 95 fire.
Yeah. And the walls, the building had been built in, 5 phases over years, over the last 100 years. And so every wall was different. Every window was different.
And just for listeners and viewers, this is the architecture building, which is it a Civil War? It started in Civil War?
Yeah, just after the Civil War, built as a high school in different pieces and parts. And so it really was a kind of every window and every wall was different, and trying to find a language for the window frames on the inside to manage the air infiltration and the insulation and the other kind of stuff. And so we came up with an idea of designing these plaster surrounds that could be consistent in one direction but completely variable in 2 others. Therefore, one detail would take on all the eccentricities of all these different things. So we thought we were very clever. And the contractor came back and said, yeah, well, that's good. It's going to be like, $2,500 a window. And this is a while back, and it was like, there's no chance in our budget to do anything like that. And we thought, God, this is so simple. It's so dumb. How could it possibly be so expensive, to do the thing? Until we discovered that it was being done by the Plasterers Union, which is one of the most expensive in the city. And we modified the detail by adding a little bit of sheetrock behind one portion of the detail. And as soon as it had sheetrock, it went into the Carpenters Union, and the carpenters could assign laborers to do the work. And so we executed them at about $400 a window. And the result was the same, but understanding what goes behind why, where, when, what. It's like an amazing lesson.
Right. In that particular case, it's the modification of the detail was so slight, and it saved you so much money.
And it was 1/5 the cost. Yeah, amazing. And that's sort of building in New York,
Right.
And when you go to other places around the country, I'm beginning to work pretty much nationally now throughout. You find the eccentricities or the abilities or things that exist elsewhere. And so one of the lessons for me out of that is to actually be very proactive about that. Go and discover what you can do. My God, in Houston, I can pour concrete for nothing, by comparison to New York or Baltimore or Washington, D.C., something like that. And
so basically steep yourself in not only sort of the artistic culture of the area in which you're building in, but the political, the building culture.
Exactly, the building, because you're gonna be able to do twice as much with your work if you understand what you're trying to accomplish, where the local skill sets are. And even in the growing globalization of materials and technologies, there are still, building is
still local.
Building is pretty local. Stuff comes from all over the world, but it's coming together there on the site. And we'll begin to see, there's interesting projects in New York now that are really testing and trying to test the bounds of prefabricated construction. It's always existed, but existed for very specialized conditions. And it's interesting to see how that will affect the local, the real localization of construction. Okay. But I also think there's a good thing to that localization too, which is it counteracts the constancy of, a Denny's restaurant is a Denny's restaurant everywhere in the United States. And so the fact that you're paying attention to what it means to build in Houston versus Syracuse or something is actually part of maintaining the individualization of those cities and areas and cultures.
Let's go back to the formation of Rogers and Marvel, and I'm talking around it. And you spoke about finding out what the holes are in your practice. And this is something that I've sort of wrestled with during my sort of doing architecture is finding the right partner or partners to help you to do what you want to do. And as far as getting someone to be your partner, your business partner, to form a practice, what qualities should, say, a young person who's starting out should look for?
I would suggest that you find people that don't do what you do. And it's not necessarily trying to find somebody like yourself. It's more like trying to find somebody different than yourself. And one of the things that I learned over the 20 years that Jonathan and I worked together is, we needed to bring in people with more technical expertise, with more business expertise, other things. And that's where, I think that life is always about evolving and growing. And if you reach a point of being too comfortable, then you're gonna kind of stay where you are. And so it also means that you need people that will challenge you. You need people that will question you and push. Because I think leadership is not the proverbial always being out in front. I think leadership is much more about trying to get the right skill sets organized to take on a particular task.
Yeah.
And in that sense, I feel like I really trust my instincts from a design point of view, but then you trust your intellect in building the team and the right team to take on particular projects. Because architecture it's so complex.
Yeah, I when I first started off this thing, I was like, architecture is like any other profession. You spend some time doing it and you steep yourself into it. But I think about even the masters. Someone like Corbusier, taking 20 years to really develop, to become who he became, the Corbusier that we remember.
Yeah.
People forget the houses that he did in Switzerland, which are, a kind of, in my mind, a kind of hodgepodge.
Yeah, little rural exercises, but beginning and thinking and testing and getting one or two pieces right.
Yeah. And even
Frank Lloyd, you begin the whole thing. Yeah.
Even Frank Lloyd Wright took about 20 years. It took him much longer than that to develop a fireplace that was properly scaled. So you're absolutely right that it is much more complex because there's so many, like what you were saying in the very beginning about the Wall Street Project, ascribing a program to those sort of barriers. A building has to do more than one thing.
Yeah, and a good building does lots of things, amazing things, and it does amazing things that you never see, touch, or feel, and it does amazing things that are right there in front of you and they're tactile. And it's one of the other reasons. I mean, for all we kind of groan sometimes about the complexity of the length of the duration, the challenge of the business, all the other things architects do with each other about this stuff. It's a marvelous thing to do with your life. I'm doing a really cool offices for one of the sort of hot ad agencies right now, and that's really fun. And here's this guy who's, running this company. He's all over the world. He's booking Jay-Z's new stuff. He's doing all these things. And he turns to me and he goes, "Boy, it's so cool what you do, because then these things last. And I see some of your projects, working on a project on the mall in DC is, and he said, I can make this amazing cultural statement, but, if it lasts 2 weeks, it's a big one."
Right.
And
it fades away. It fades away.
And that is, it's a really, if if you can get to it and work with it and live within the boundaries that are a practicing architect, it's a very elegant thing to do with your life.
Now, I'm going to get back to what your architecture was.
Okay.
At the time that I met you and what it is today. And at the time when you just started off, what were the things that you focused in on? And I think you've touched on it throughout our different subjects that we sort of jumped into. What are the things that you were concerned about and wanted to make sure that was accomplished?
I think, my early efforts were really trying to be competent in terms of program and technology, and find a move or two moves, which may be structural or material or spatial or about transparency, where you could kind of test an idea. And at that scale of those projects that I was doing then, that's kind of, that was like the scale of ideas you could test. And now what I like to do is talk about the relationship with the city, the relationship with history, the relationship with future, like the project I'm doing in Baltimore right now with Johns Hopkins for a new K-8 school and an early childhood center that is 2 entire city blocks in East Baltimore, very difficult neighborhood. And the building is all about the carrying on the underlying structure of the row houses that were there, so that the play spaces that were traditionally the streets and the alleyways of East Baltimore are recreated in the outdoor spaces of the school. So that when you're talking about bringing this new public school into this neighborhood, it's not landing like a satellite. It actually is coming from the fabric of the neighborhood itself, and it doesn't mean that it's a historic building. It's all precast with form liner and stained concrete. So it's an absolutely modern and contemporary building, but it has this sort of skeletal echo of the structure of the buildings and spaces and the rhythms that were the buildings and spatial relationships of that neighborhood for 150 years. And that's like, now I'm trying to work like that. I'm not trying to just be competent and good and find a move or two. It's like, how do we operate in this neighborhood? How do we operate in this social context of a neighborhood that went from this vibrant working class 75 years ago to one of the most challenged, difficult urban neighborhoods now? And you do that with program, you do that with the structure of the building, you do it with the character, the materiality, the quality. How do you make it feel open, accessible? How do you make sure that the neighborhood owns it, both program, structure, and aesthetic?
But what you're saying then is your initial notions of architecture. Your notion of architecture now is vastly more sophisticated than most of your contemporaries, because you're looking at it as a means to test yourself in a way, to expand your knowledge of architecture in these different realms, which were normally not talked about in architecture schools.
Yeah.
But even your initial notion of architecture, which is basically testing an idea, it's still very sophisticated in a way, because I bumped into my own contemporaries who are still trying to shovel all different kinds of ideas into a project, regardless of its size or scope.
Yeah.
And So you knew from the beginning that you're like, I don't know that much, but I'm going to learn.
Yeah, and the it's interesting when you talk about how many ideas you can get into a project, and if there are subtle overlays and variations of the same idea, you can get a lot. But actually competing ideas, I believe, really you can only get a few and have a successful building. Otherwise, it becomes too much of a test case of too many things going on. In terms of its durability over time, its rigor, and indeed even its restraint, if I can use that word. In a way.
Yeah, my own notions of architecture, for instance, is that there has to be a narrative. It doesn't have to be an overt narrative. Mm-hmm. There has to be a narrative, even if it's just in your mind. And it's a successful project when not that someone from the streets kind of come in and go, oh, I see a narrative. But they come in, like, for instance, here in the city, the Ford Foundation building. Mm-hmm. How people just walk into that building and they feel at home right away. I mean, that's just that atrium area. Yeah. But they feel at home right away. And it's not that they could, well, I see how they came up with the design. It's just something that they come in and they're automatically in tune with. And that's a successful building. I don't know if you feel it.
It's a terrific building. And that's exactly, for instance, what I'm trying to do in Baltimore, which is nobody has to sit there and go look at the maps and understand how much we understood.
Right.
The structure of the city to organize the school in this
They don't have to understand the formality.
They just need to go like, this space feels familiar. I remember, when I was a kid, we used to play in spaces like that. It doesn't have to be obtuse. It doesn't have to be anything more than a sensibility in that way. And I think I don't really think of it in terms of a narrative, but I think that there's an idea structure I would use for a project. And when you determine that, and it gets established usually pretty early as you're doing conceptual work and really understanding, for me, site and program and all the other things that come into that, you need to hold on to that. And the role that idea structure plays is that as choices and opportunities come up, they either enhance the idea structure or they don't.
Yeah.
No, it's that measure. It's the measure of how you develop, the ability to both innovate and be consistent, which seem like opposites, but I think they actually you can't do one without the other. Yeah.
No, let me sort of redefine, but let me define what I mean when I say narrative. Narrative, in my mind, is something that comes after you figure out sort of the timbre, the timbre of the site, which is a unique voice of that site. And you're talking about that as far as not only just the site itself, the building itself, but you're talking about it sort of politically and just as far as the neighborhood is concerned, as far as the city is concerned, all of these different layers that go into the project. When you've sort of steeped yourself in that, then you could figure out the solution comes after working out all of these different things.
Yeah. And, understanding a site is always a completely different exercise, right? In Baltimore, it's studying history. It's driving through neighborhoods. It's walking around. It's understanding, that kind of thing. And, one of my favorite exercises, and I was doing a project in Wyoming where there were no roads yet into the area that we were looking at to go and build. And so I spent 3 days on horseback with the owner, just riding and talking about views and weather and wind and where we could go and how we could get up here and what would we do and how does it lay into the land and what are you going to see? How can you not be seen? And it's like you can't just look at a topographic map. Mm-hmm. I think that you really have to get out there.
Or is what people who are not architects look at, which is Google Maps. You can't just look at Google Maps.
You gotta get out there, whatever vehicle or animal gives you access, and get out there and really understand it. You know.
Yeah. So I was speaking about when you started off and your notion of sort of testing an idea into a project, and I was saying how sophisticated that was. And I haven't really talked about your background. You said you were from Colorado,
yeah.
Denver, Colorado area there, and both your parents were architects,
Right.
and do you think that because I think when both your parents were architects, I think you probably have a little leg up on your contemporaries, right?
Maybe. I mean, it's also there's a presumption about what practice is and what it means, because that's what you've seen.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's no doubt whatever genetic condition exists in terms of architects to architects of sort of having spatial understanding,
Mm-hmm.
My daughter has it, like, since she was 5 years old. I was stunned at her understanding of three-dimensional space in the abstract. And so some of it is maybe just genetic in that sense. Then there's just the realities of, my mother wouldn't let me rearrange the furniture in my room because, this doesn't work, the door doesn't swing, you can't move over. It's like, what? I'm just pushing my stuff around.
Yeah.
But then there's a kind of understanding that, well, that's who architects are, and that's what architects do. And I liked it and went to school, and I thought that was pretty good. But when I came to New York, I kind of overcame that whole idea, and I had to rethink for myself, because
Overcame what idea?
Of what an architect is and what a practice is like, and that's the way my dad's practice worked, and so that's how a practice is, and that's what you make in terms of buildings, and that's how it goes along. And I sort of had to intentionally remove myself from that environment and come to, the antithesis of Denver, which is New York, nitty gritty,
Mm-hmm.
Very competitive, and in an environment like Pay's office, where one person after another was smarter, more worldly, more trained. I was, I was like stunned, and at the range of skills and experiences. And that let me begin to reshape for myself. What is architecture? What do you want to accomplish? Where do you want to go? What do you want to do? Because I think I think that's where it may be a little disadvantage growing up in that life.
Well,
in that sense,
Well, you had the opportunity to, before you even graduated school, to see another point of view.
Yeah.
Which is very important.
It was critical.
I mean, I had a similar experience when I went to Rome at Pratt, the Rome program, where I had this notion of what building in a city is, which is like grids, and you have to, I remember sort of design classes like, well, you have to make the building loud enough so that people from the street will be attracted into the building. Where you go to Rome, where it's just a building is there, and it's always been there. You don't have to attract people to it.
Yeah,
it's a sort of a pedestrian culture, and pedestrian in the sense that you actually walk from place to place. And the notion of architecture as not a grid.
Yeah,
there's different layers of civilization.
Yeah, well, and they've had a long time to put it together.
Yeah,
but it's also the architecture as fabric, and that's always been the challenge, I think, in architecture schools in the U.S. Is that in the end, cities need fabric as much or more than they need icons, and school is always about icons, seldom about fabric, and the movements that have pushed fabric.
Explain the difference between them for the listeners over here, between icon and fabric.
Well, the icon is the building that stands out and is exceptional either by its form, its materiality, whether it's the Empire State Building of its era,
or the
Hearst
city
building,
the City Court building,
or City Court, or Tom Maine's new building right over here on Cooper Square.
Mm-hmm.
It is all about calling attention to itself. Doesn't mean, like Tom Maine's building, doesn't mean that it's not the right scale. It doesn't mean it's not contextual. I believe that building is.
Mm-hmm.
But it's about its distinction. And a fabric building is really about its non-distinction. It's holding the street wall. It's doing a good job. It's being a decent building, but it's not trying to stand out. And cities need both.
Absolutely.
And, schools, unfortunately, the schools teach towards the icon. And when they don't, you end up with kind of, new urbanism or some other kind of, wash-water version of making fabric.
Yeah.
That it gets overlaid with sentimentality instead of elegance of materiality or whatever it is. I don't think fabric has anything to do with any style. It just has to do with behavior relative to buildings adjacent and around, of the building itself.
Another example, just so that people understand, is the Guggenheim Museum by Frank Lloyd Wright.
Right.
That building wouldn't work if there were Guggenheims on every corner.
Exactly. And you need the nice, banal regularity of, they're good buildings, but the Fifth Avenue apartment buildings.
Right. It's a block.
Yeah. Right. And that's probably one of the clearest examples, of the icon versus the neighborhood.
So we were speaking about practice a little bit there, and I noticed on the Rogers Marvel website competitions that you did, and it's always curious to me because a lot of firms that I worked with didn't feel they had time for competitions. How did you make time for competitions? Because you're building an office, and from what I read, you started off with basically just repairs and renovation. A lot of the projects, sort of bread and butter projects, as they would say. Mm-hmm. And when you're trying to build a reputation, you don't have the iconic projects. You don't have the Constitution Park project. How do you make time for competitions and pay your people?
A couple of ways. One is just make it ingrained in the culture of the office that you're going to always be doing something. And it doesn't mean like crazy. There are offices that do 50 competitions a year. Mm-hmm. And I've always liked to do a couple a year. And you gather people together in teams that are different than the projects that are ongoing. So you're not crippling any particular project by pulling staff away, but you're kind of crippling all your projects. No, you're drawing on all those resources. You're asking people to perform a little more, but a lot of times you get to perform in another role because you've been embedded on this project for a year, but now you get to pull back and think about
wait a minute, hold on.
Some crazy thing in a new city.
Hold on, wait a minute.
So
but wait a minute. I said I was going to ask a couple of questions, but what you just said, you have tons of questions now, which is, and this is a typical way of American business, which is you get someone in the office and they're good at doing item A. Mm-hmm. What you're saying to me is that you want to have the person who knows how to do item A to do item B and C also.
Yeah, or cross over, pull and be a part of this other team. And it can be it may be making models, it may be making drawings, it may be part of the conceptual work.
Okay.
But that you cross. And it's also so that you can maintain the operations of the firm and the practice and everything going on, and actually take this extra load of work to do a competition and do that also. It's kind of an added on. And if they're good and interesting projects, when we did the I-Beam Museum competition years ago to the Eisenhower Memorial.
Eisenhower, which I particularly love. I love that project, by the way.
Yeah, me too. I think I don't think it'll ever see the light of day, but it was a terrific exercise. And,
it seemed
and
radical. The image seemed radical, but it's not radical.
It's not.
I see the same angles in the War Memorial for the Vietnam War Memorial.
It's there. It's also was the underpinnings of that were actually reading things about Eisenhower, where, like, to him, and yes, he'd go and he'd talk man to man with the enlisted guys in the infantry and everything like that, but his uniform was absolutely crisp, pressed, and that was his manner, his demeanor, and we felt that was almost a place to take off. Is like the building had to have that sort of
formality,
and a finesse and attention to detail that was a sort of had to do with the obsession that you need to become as good as he became. And that is something that in its overall form needed to be slightly radical so that you would pay attention and not think, oh, it's just a nice thing. Wow. And then you realize it's actually very simple. And it has these patterns, and it's got kind of humble underpinnings.
Now that you've formed this, your new office,
Rogers Partners.
What do you see for the future? Because you're essentially in a similar situation when I met you 21 years ago. You're starting again.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I think I mentioned it before, but being able to hit the refresh button every once in a while is incredibly. It's scary and it's fabulous, and I think that what I really look at is the practice of the last 20 years has really built this foundation that's given me enough expertise and understanding and foundation to now explore in more depth. I will have 4 associate partners who I really trust. One really is a leader in urban design. One is amazing in education. One of them is like the person who can take early ideas and turn them into architecture through materiality and resolution. And so you kind of feel like you got this core team of thinkers, and we'll continue to augment. We got room to grow some more, and we'll be 30 odd people. So it's not like it's a small office. And focusing on projects where we think we can actually use as many of our skills to their fullest as possible.
Rogers Partners is now located at 100 Reed Street in Manhattan. To hear and see more of Rob's work, go to insidethephoenix.com/extras/Rob Rogers Works. This is Warren Wade Anderson. Thank you for spending time with Inside the Phoenix.